wanted Bandit hid in a schoolhouse. Until the young teacher called him father. He'd killed 3 men that morning and had a bullet in his shoulder. But when an 8-year-old girl looked up from her schoolwork and called the most wanted outlaw in the territory Papa, everything changed. This is the true story of how a forgotten schoolhouse became the place where redemption finally caught up to a man who'd been running from it his whole life. The bullet had gone clean through Jake Morrison's shoulder, but the blood wouldn't stop. Each step sent fire down his arm and across his chest, painting dark drops in the dust behind him like a trail any fool could follow. The sun was setting behind the hills, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for him with accusing fingers. He'd been running for 2 days straight. The bank job in Millerville had gone wrong from the start. The sheriff had been waiting, almost like he'd known they were coming. Jake's partners were dead now, gunned down in the street while he'd escaped through the back window, clutching a canvas bag that held barely enough to buy him a week's worth of beans. The schoolhouse appeared through the heat shimmer like a mirage, its weathered with siding the color of old bones. The bell tower stood crooked against the darkening sky, and weeds had grown tall around the foundation. Looked empty, looked forgotten, looked like salvation. Jake stumbled up the 3 wooden steps, his boots echoing hollow on the porch. The door hung slightly open, creaking in the evening breeze. He pushed it wider with his good arm and stepped inside, letting his eyes adjust to the dim interior. The smell hit him first, chalk dust and something else. Something alive. Something that didn't belong in an abandoned building. Don't move another step. The voice was soft, but it carried the kind of steel that made smart men listen. Jake's hand went instinctively to his Colt, but froze when he saw her. A young woman stood behind the teacher's desk, her brown hair pulled back in a simple bun, her dress the plain blue of working folk. She held a worn leather Bible against her chest like a shield, but her green eyes held no fear. Mom. Jake kept his hand near his gun but didn't draw. Didn't know anyone was here. Clearly, her gaze moved to the blood seeping through his shirt, then back to his face. You're hurt. I'll live. Will you? She set the Bible down on the desk with deliberate care. Because you look like a man who's been running from something that catches up to everyone eventually. Jake studied her in the fading light that filtered through the dusty windows. She was young, maybe 22, 23, but there was something in her manner that spoke of loss, of growing up too fast in a hard country. The schoolhouse around them told its own story. Children's drawings still pinned to the walls. Letters of the alphabet chalked on a blackboard. Small desks arranged in neat rows as if waiting for students who might never return. This your school? He asked. It's nobody's school now. Town council closed it last spring. Said there weren't enough children left to justify keeping a teacher. She moved out from behind the desk, and Jake noticed she walked with the quiet confidence of someone who'd learned to be alone. But children still need learning, whether the council thinks so or not. You still teaching? Some. She lifted her chin slightly. The Hendricks children come by twice a week. The Morrison girl, when her father can spare her from chores. Few others. At the mention of the Morrison name, Jake's jaw tightened. Morrison, little family farm about 5 miles north. Sweet child, maybe 8 years old. Bright as a new penny, but her father. The woman shook her head. Well, some folks carry their grief in ways that hurt the people they love most. Jake felt something twist in his chest. Morrison. It wasn't an uncommon name, but hearing it here, now, felt like a sign from a god he'd stopped believing in years ago. What's your name, mister? He hesitated. Giving his real name meant risk, but something about this woman, the way she stood her ground without a weapon, the way she spoke of teaching children in a forgotten schoolhouse, made him want to tell the truth for once. Jake. Just Jake. For now. She nodded as if that was answer enough. I'm Sarawis. And you're bleeding on my floor. Jake looked down. She was right. Red drops had been falling steadily from his fingertips, staining the worn wooden boards where generations of children had learned their letters. I can clean that up. You can sit down before you fall down. Sarah moved to a cabinet in the corner and pulled out a tin basin and a cloth that had seen better days. There's a back room where I stay sometimes. You can rest there while I tend to that wound. Why would you help me? Sarah paused, the basin halfway to the water pump by the window. Maybe because this is a place of learning, and the first thing you learn out here is that everybody's running from something. The second thing you learn is that sometimes the thing you're running toward is more important than what you're running from. Jake stared at her, this young woman who spoke like she'd lived 3 lifetimes in her brief years. The pain in his shoulder was getting worse, and the edges of his vision were starting to blur. He needed rest, needed time to think, needed to figure out his next move. But mostly, he needed to understand why hearing about a Morrison child had felt like being struck by lightning. "All right," he said finally. "I'll take your help. But if anyone comes looking for me, then we'll deal with that when it happens." Sarah turned back to the pump, working the handle until water splashed into the basin. "Right now, you need to stop bleeding before you die in my schoolhouse and traumatize the children." Despite everything, the pain, the fear, the weight of his crimes, Jake almost smiled. Almost. In the gathering darkness outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and carrying with it the distant sound of horses. Or maybe it was just his imagination. Maybe it was just the sound of a past that refused to stay buried, no matter how far or how fast a man might run. But in this moment, in this forgotten schoolhouse where a young teacher still believed in the power of learning and second chances, Jake Morrison allowed himself to think that maybe, just maybe, he'd found something worth stopping for. For 3 days, the wanted man watched through a crack in the door as she taught children to read, never knowing one of those children shared his name. The fever broke on the 3rd morning, leaving Jake weak but clear-headed for the first time since stumbling into the schoolhouse. Sarah had kept her word, tending his wound with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd doctored plenty of cuts and scrapes. She'd also kept her distance, sleeping in the main classroom while he recovered in the small back room that had once stored supplies and now held nothing but dust and memories. He could hear her moving around out there in the early light, sweeping the floor, arranging the desks, preparing for another day of teaching children whose parents still believed in the power of letters and numbers. Through the crack in the door that didn't quite close right, Jake watched her work. She moved with purpose, this Sarah Wells. Every gesture deliberate, every action serving some greater design he couldn't quite grasp. She'd pin fresh drawings to the wall, wildflowers pressed between pages, stick figures of families, houses with smoke curling from crooked chimneys. Then she'd stand back and study them like they were masterpieces in some grand museum back east. "Good morning, Miss Sarah." The voice belonged to a boy, maybe 10 years old, bursting through the front door with the kind of energy that made adults tired just watching. Behind him came 2 girls, one about his age and another smaller one who couldn't have been more than 6. "Good morning, Tommy. Mary. Emma." Sarah's voice carried a warmth that Jake hadn't heard during their careful conversations of the past few days. "Are you ready for your arithmetic today? Do we have to?" This from Mary, dragging her feet as she took her seat at one of the small desks. "Learning is like water," Sarah said, moving to the blackboard. "You can't see how it shapes the rock until years have passed, but it shapes it all the same." Jake found himself leaning closer to the crack in the door. There was something hypnotic about watching her teach, the way she moved between the children with infinite patience, never raising her voice, never showing frustration when they struggled with their letters or fumbled their sums. "Now, Emma, can you show us how to write your name?" The smallest girl, blonde hair and pigtails, missing her front teeth, took the chalk with serious concentration. She formed each letter with the careful precision of someone for whom writing was still magic. Emma and Morrison. Jake's breath caught in his throat. Morrison, the child he'd been wondering about, the little girl whose father carried his grief in ways that hurt the people he loved most. She was right here, not 5 feet from where he hid, writing her name on the same blackboard where he'd once done the same thing, back when the world made sense and fathers came home to their children. "Beautiful work, Emma," Sarah said softly. "Your letters are getting much stronger. Papa says writing ain't gonna help me milk cows or tend chickens," Emma said, setting down the chalk. "Isn't going to help," Sarah corrected gently. "And maybe your papa's right about the cows and chickens. But what if someday you want to write a letter to someone far away? What if you want to read stories about places beyond these hills? Emma considered this with the gravity only children can bring to impossible questions. I'd like to read about the ocean. Papa says it's water that goes on forever. Then we'll find you a book about the ocean, Sarah promised. Jake closed his eyes, remembering another little girl who'd wanted to read about impossible things, who died before she could learn that the world was bigger than their small cabin, bigger than the fever that took her while her father was away robbing banks to pay for medicine that came too late. The morning lessons continued, reading from a worn primer, practicing penmanship, working through simple arithmetic problems that Sarah made into stories about horses and harvests. Jake found himself drawn into the rhythm of it, the gentle cadence of learning that he'd forgotten existed. When the children left at midday, chattering about their lessons as they walked back toward their scattered homes, silence settled over the schoolhouse like dust after a windstorm. "You can come out now," Sarah said without turning around. Jake emerged from the back room, feeling foolish. Didn't want to scare them. They're frontier children. Takes more than a stranger to scare them. Sarah was erasing the blackboard, rubbing away the morning's lessons. Besides, Emma could use knowing there are men in the world who care about learning. Her father doesn't. Sarah's hand paused on the board. Her father is complicated. Lost his wife to fever 2 years ago. Been drinking away his grief ever since, leaving Emma to raise herself most days. Jake felt something cold settle in his stomach. What happened to Emma's mother? Consumption. Lingered for months while he tried everything. Doctors from Denver, medicine from back east, even took her to the hot springs thinking the waters might cure her. Sarah set down the eraser and faced him. Spent every dollar he had and borrowed plenty he didn't. Nothing worked. The room seemed to tilt around Jake. He gripped the back of one of the small desks to steady himself. This Morrison, what's his first name? James. What? The world went quiet except for the sound of his own heartbeat. James Morrison. Jamie. His younger brother, who'd married sweet Mary Hutchins when Jake was already running with rough men, making choices that led away from family and toward the dark places where wanted posters carried your face. Jake, you look like you've seen a ghost. Maybe he had. Maybe he'd been living as one for so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to be real, to be connected to something that mattered more than the next job or the next town or the next chance to outrun the consequences of a life lived wrong. I knew her mother, he said finally. Long time ago. Sarah studied his face with those perceptive green eyes. You knew Mary Morrison? I knew Mary Hutchins before she married James. Jake sank into one of the small chairs, his knees nearly touching his chin. She was going to be my sister-in-law. The confession hung between them like smoke from a dying fire. Sarah moved to the window, looking out toward the hills where Emma Morrison was walking home to a father who drank away his grief instead of facing it. Emma doesn't know she has an uncle, Sarah said quietly. Emma's uncle is a wanted man who robs banks for a living, Jake replied. She's better off not knowing. Is he? Sarah turned from the window. Or is he a man who made bad choices trying to save someone he loved, just like her father did? Jake looked around the schoolhouse, at the children's drawings on the walls, at the alphabet chalked on the board, at the woman who taught forgotten children in a forgotten place, and somehow still believed that people could learn to be better than they were. Outside, the wind was picking up again, carrying with it the scent of approaching rain and the distant sound that might have been horses, or might have been thunder, or might have been the past finally catching up to a man who'd been running too long from the truth about why he'd started running in the first place. But for now, in this moment, Jake Morrison sat in a child's chair in his brother's daughter's classroom and wondered if it was possible to learn something new about himself, even this late in the game. When the 8-year-old girl looked up from her arithmetic and called the wanted outlaw Papa, the silence that followed shattered 2 broken hearts. The morning of the 5th day brought Emma Morrison alone to the schoolhouse, her small face streaked with tears she'd tried to wipe away. Sarah met her at the door, kneeling down to the child's level with the instinctive grace of someone who understood that sometimes the most important lessons had nothing to do with books. What's wrong, sweetheart? Papa was drinking again last night, Emma whispered, her voice barely carrying over the morning breeze. He threw Mama's picture at the wall and broke the glass. Then he just sat there crying, and I didn't know how to help him. From the back room, Jake felt his chest tighten. He'd been listening to Emma's lessons for days now, watching through the crack in the door as she worked through her letters with determined concentration, never knowing he was seeing his own blood, his brother's child, struggling with problems that should never touch someone so young. Sarah pulled Emma into a gentle embrace. Sometimes grown-ups carry hurt so deep they don't know how to let it out except in ways that make everyone else hurt too. Miss Sarah, do you think my mama can see me from heaven? Do you think she knows I'm trying to learn my letters like she wanted? I think she sees you, Sarah said softly. And I think she's proud of how brave and smart you're growing up to be. Emma nodded, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. Can we do arithmetic today? Numbers are easier than letters. They don't change their meaning when you're not looking. Of course we can. They settled into their routine. Sarah at the blackboard, Emma at her small desk, working through problems that started simple and grew more challenging. Jake found himself drawn to the crack in the door again, watching his niece's face scrunch up in concentration as she worked. The arithmetic was going well until Emma encountered a problem about a farmer who had 12 horses but sold 4. The subtractions stumped her, and she stared at the slate with growing frustration. I can't figure it out, she said, her voice starting to crack. The numbers won't stay still in my head. Sarah started to rise from her desk, but Jake found himself moving before he could think better of it. The backroom door opened with a soft creak, and he stepped into the main classroom for the first time since arriving. Emma looked up at him with curious eyes, showing no fear. Children on the frontier learned early to judge people by their actions rather than their appearance, and Jake had been nothing but quiet and gentle during his hidden presence in her classroom. May I help? He asked, glancing at Sarah, who nodded almost imperceptibly. Jake knelt beside Emma's desk, his large frame folding down to her level. What's the problem giving you trouble? It's about horses, Emma said, showing him her slate. A farmer has 12, but he sells 4. Miss Sarah says I need to take away, but I don't understand how you can take away something that's not there anymore. Jake studied the problem, remembering another little girl who'd struggled with arithmetic, who'd counted on her fingers and asked him questions that made him see the world through younger eyes. Well, he said slowly, let's say you have 12 wildflowers in a field. Beautiful ones, all different colors. But then winter comes and takes 4 of them away. The flowers aren't there anymore, but you still remember them, don't you? You still know they existed. Emma nodded, her eyes brightening. So the arithmetic isn't really about the horses being gone. It's about remembering how many there were and understanding what remains. 12 horses, minus for that went to new homes, leaves 8 horses still in the field. Emma worked the problem on her slate, her tongue poking out in concentration. When she arrived at the right answer, her face lit up with triumph. I did it. I figured it out. She looked up at Jake with pure joy. Thank you for helping me, Papa. The word hung in the air like dust motes caught in afternoon sunlight. Emma's hand flew to her mouth as she realized what she'd said, her cheeks flushing red with embarrassment. I'm sorry, she whispered. I didn't mean... But Jake couldn't speak. The simple word, Papa, had torn something open inside him that he'd spent years trying to keep closed. He saw his own daughter's face in Emma's features, heard her voice in the way Emma said his name, felt the crushing weight of all the moments he'd missed, all the lessons he'd never gotten to teach, all the love he'd never been able to give. Sarah moved quietly to Emma's side, her hand resting gently on the child's shoulder. It's all right, sweetheart. Sometimes our hearts know things before our heads do. Emma looked between Sarah and Jake, sensing the weight of something she didn't understand. Did I say something wrong? No. Jake managed, his voice rough. You didn't say anything wrong. He stood slowly, moving to the window, where he could see the distant hills and the sky that seemed to go on forever. Behind him, he heard Sarah explaining to Emma that the stranger had lost someone very precious, that sometimes adults needed quiet to work through their feelings. When Emma's footsteps faded as Sarah walked her to the door for an early dismissal, Jake finally turned around. Sarah stood in the center of the classroom, her hands folded, her green eyes filled with understanding. She didn't know, she said softly. I know. Jake sank into one of the larger chairs, burying his face in his hands. But for just a moment, it felt like I had a daughter again. Sarah moved closer, her presence a quiet comfort. Tell me about her. Your daughter. The story came out in broken pieces. How he tried to be a good father, working honest jobs that never paid enough. How the fever had come to their cabin while he was away looking for work. How he'd sold everything, borrowed against the future, even turned to robbery to pay for medicine from the city doctors. How she died while he was away on his first bank job, calling for a papa who wasn't there because he was trying to save her life by destroying his own. Her name was Lucy, he said finally. She was 8 years old, same as Emma. And after she died, I had nothing left to lose. Figured if I was already damned, might as well make it count for something. Jake looked around the schoolhouse, at the children's drawings on the walls, at the evidence of hope and learning and futures being built one lesson at a time. But being here, watching Emma learn, seeing her struggle with the same problems Lucy used to... He shook his head. I don't know what I'm doing anymore, Sarah. You're remembering who you were before the grief changed you, she said simply. You're remembering that there are still children in the world who need someone to teach them about wildflowers and arithmetic. Children who might call you Papa and mean it. Outside, the sound of approaching hoofbeats carried on the wind, distant still, but unmistakable. They both heard it, both understood what it meant. They're getting closer, Sarah said. Jake nodded, standing and moving toward his gun belt hanging on a peg by the back room door. I should go, before they find me here and put you in danger. Or, Sarah said quietly, you could stay. You could face whatever's coming and fight for the chance to be the man Emma saw when she looked at you just now. Jake's hand stopped on his gun belt. Through the window, he could see the dust cloud on the horizon, growing larger. Soon he would have to choose, run again and remain forever the man who lost everything, or stay and fight for the possibility that broken things could still be mended. The afternoon shadows stretched long across the classroom floor, and somewhere in the distance, a child walked home alone to a father who'd forgotten how to be anything but grief. But here, in this forgotten schoolhouse where strangers became family and outlaws remembered how to teach arithmetic, Jake Morrison stood on the edge of discovering whether redemption was something a man could earn, or something that found him when he finally stopped running long enough to let it catch up. When the sheriff surrounded the schoolhouse at dawn, the outlaw had a choice: run like he always had, or let a teacher and her students show him what courage really looked like. The riders came with the sunrise, their horses' hooves drumming against the hard-packed earth like thunder before a storm. Jake counted 6 of them through the schoolhouse window, Sheriff Morrison leading, his badge catching the early light, followed by 5 deputies with rifles across their saddles, a determination written in the set of their shoulders. Sheriff Morrison. Jake almost laughed at the bitter irony. Even his brother had become a lawman, choosing the opposite path while Jake had spiraled deeper into darkness. Jake. Sarah's voice was steady, but he could hear the fear underneath. They're the back way out, through the storage room window. You could know. Jake stepped away from the window, his hand moving to his gun belt out of habit before stopping. I'm done running. They'll arrest you. Maybe worse. Maybe. Jake looked around the schoolhouse one last time, at the children's drawings on the walls, at the blackboard where Emma had struggled with her arithmetic, at the woman who'd shown him that broken things could still teach beautiful lessons. But if I run now, I'll spend the rest of my life wondering what might have happened if I'd been brave enough to stay. Outside, Sheriff Morrison's voice cut through the morning air. Jake Morrison, we know you're in there. Come out with your hands where we can see them. Jake moved toward the door, but Sarah caught his arm. Wait. She walked to her desk and pulled out a small wooden box, extracting something that gleamed silver in the morning light. A teacher's bell, worn smooth by years of calling children to lessons. Take this. Sarah, I don't trust me. The schoolhouse door opened with a creak that seemed to echo across the valley. Jake stepped onto the porch, his hands raised, Sarah close behind him. The morning sun was low and golden, casting everything in the kind of light that made even hard truths look beautiful. Sheriff Morrison dismounted, his rifle trained on Jake's chest. Up close, Jake could see the family resemblance, the same dark eyes, the same stubborn jawline, the same way of holding his shoulders when facing something difficult. "Hello, Jamie," Jake said quietly. The sheriff's face went white. The rifle wavered. "Jake, been a long time, little brother." James Morrison stared across the distance between them. Not just the 20 yards of dusty ground, but the years of choices and consequences that had led them to this moment. His deputies shifted nervously, unsure why their sheriff had suddenly gone still as stone. "You're the bank robber we've been chasing," James said, his voice hollow. "I am. The one who killed 3 men in Millerville." They drew first. Jake kept his hands raised, but his voice was steady. "I won't lie to you, Jamie. I've done things I'm not proud of. Robbed banks, stolen horses, lived outside the law for more years than I care to count. But I never killed a man who didn't try to kill me first." One of the deputies spat in the dust. "Sheriff, we didn't come here to chat with outlaws. Let's get him hogtied and back to town." But James Morrison wasn't listening to his deputies. He was staring at his brother, seeing something in Jake's face that made him lower his rifle just slightly. "Why here?" James asked. "Why the schoolhouse?" Before Jake could answer, another voice cut through the morning air. "Papa." Emma Morrison came running across the field, her blonde pigtails streaming behind her, her small legs carrying her as fast as they could toward the sound of her father's voice. Behind her, at a more sedate pace, came Tommy and Mary, drawn by the commotion. "Emma, no." James started toward his daughter, but she was already climbing the schoolhouse steps. "Miss Sarah, is everything all right?" Emma looked between the adults, sensing the tension but not understanding it. Then her eyes fell on Jake, and her face lit up with recognition. "Oh, it's a nice man who helped me with my arithmetic." The deputies exchanged glances. One of them, a young man with nervous eyes, tightened his grip on his rifle. "Emma," Sarah said gently, "why don't you come stand with me?" But Emma was already moving toward Jake, her child's instinct telling her that the man who'd patiently taught her about wildflowers and subtraction couldn't possibly be dangerous. She slipped her small hand into his much larger one. "Papa, this is the man I told you about. The one who's been helping Miss Sarah fix things around the school. He carved my name in a piece of wood yesterday. Want to see?" James Morrison looked at his daughter, holding hands with the most wanted man in 3 counties, and something shifted in his expression. The hard lines around his eyes softened. The rigid set of his shoulders relaxed just a fraction. "Emma," he said quietly, "step away from that man." "Why?" Emma looked confused. "He's nice, Papa. He knows stories about horses and flowers, and he doesn't smell like whiskey like you do." The words hit James like a physical blow. Jake saw his brother's face crumple, saw the weight of his own grief and failure written there as clearly as words on a page. "She's right," James said, so quietly only Jake could hear. "I've been so lost in missing Mary that I forgot Emma was still here, still needing a father." "It's not too late," Jake said. "It's never too late to come home to the people who love you." Sarah stepped forward then, her voice carrying across the schoolyard with the same quiet authority she used in her classroom. "Sheriff Morrison," she said, "your brother's been here for a week. He's fixed our broken door, mended 3 desks, and helped Emma with her lessons every morning. If he was the dangerous criminal you're hunting, don't you think he would have hurt us by now?" The young deputy shifted impatiently. "Ma'am, with respect, that doesn't change what he's done." "What he's done," Sarah interrupted, "is remember who he was before grief turned him into someone else. Just like some other men I could mention." Her eyes met James's, and Jake saw his brother understand what she was really saying. That they'd both lost Mary. That they'd both let that loss define them. That they'd both forgotten there were still people in the world who needed them to be better. Tommy stepped forward then, clutching a slate with Jake's name carefully chalked on it. "Sheriff, he taught me how to write curse words. But he made me promise never to use them where ladies could hear." Despite everything, James almost smiled. Jake felt the weight of the teacher's bell in his pocket, understanding now why Sarah had given it to him. He pulled it out slowly, careful not to make any movements that might startle the nervous deputies. "This is for Emma," he said, holding the bell out to his brother, "so she can call the other children to lessons when Miss Sarah needs help. Every school should have a bell." James took the bell, their fingers touching briefly. In that moment, Jake saw forgiveness in his brother's eyes. Not absolution. They both knew Jake would have to answer for his crimes. But forgiveness for the years of silence, for the grief that had driven them apart, for all the ways they'd failed each other and the people they loved. "Jake Morrison," James said formally, "you're under arrest for bank robbery and disturbing the peace." Jake nodded, extending his wrist for the shackles. "But," James continued, glancing at his daughter, at Sarah, at the schoolhouse where his brother had remembered how to be human, "I think a judge might be interested to hear about the circumstances. About how you've been helping the local school. About how you surrendered peacefully." As the deputies secured Jake's hands, Emma tugged on her father's sleeve. "Papa, is the nice man in trouble?" James knelt down to his daughter's level, really seeing her for the first time in months. "He made some bad choices, sweetheart. But sometimes good people make bad choices and then they have to work very hard to make things right again. Like when I broke Mama's vase and had to do extra chores. Something like that." Emma nodded solemnly, then looked at Jake. "Will you come back and help me with arithmetic when you're done being in trouble?" Jake felt his throat tighten. "I don't know, Emma. I might be in trouble for a long time." "That's okay," she said with the infinite patience of childhood. "I'll keep practicing my letters until you get back." As they led Jake away, he looked over his shoulder one last time at the schoolhouse. Sarah stood on the porch with Emma beside her, both of them watching him go. The morning sun had climbed higher, burning off the last of the shadows and painting everything in shades of gold and possibility. He'd lost everything once, his daughter, his purpose, his way home. But here, in this forgotten place where a teacher still believed in second chances and a little girl had called him Papa, Jake Morrison had found something worth more than freedom. He'd found redemption. And sometimes, that was enough to light the way toward whatever came next. Behind them, the schoolhouse bell began to ring, not calling children to lessons, but marking the end of one story and the beginning of another. In the distance, dust settled back to earth, and the frontier morning stretched ahead like an unwritten page, waiting for someone brave enough to put pencil to paper and see what tomorrow might hold.